At 9:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Evald Swanson sat in the cockpit of the B-17G Flying Fortress Mispa, watching black flat clouds erupt across the sky above Budapest. He was 24 years old, had flown 17 combat missions, and knew there was no room for mistakes. Below, the Luftwaffe's 288mm flat guns surrounded the railway yards, and every one of them was firing. Swanson's plane was part of the 60-aircraft formation from the 483rd Bomb Group, taking off from Sterperone, Italy. On paper, the mission was simple: hit the shell oil refinery and the railway yards at the heart of German-controlled Budapest, disrupt supply lines to the Eastern Front, and return home. But by July 1944, crews in the 15th Air Force understood the grim odds. For every 10 men who climbed into a B-17, only 2 would return. The rest would die, be captured, or vanish. Through the curtain of flak, the formation pushed forward. Explosions ripped the air in black clouds capable of shredding aluminum like paper. Mispa was struck in the tail and wings. Shrapnel tore holes in the fuselage. Yet the bomber held its place in formation. Behind him, the crew remained at their stations. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt in the co-pilot seat, Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley at the bombardier station, and Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson at the navigator's post. 8 more men were stationed throughout the aircraft: gunners, radio operators, the flight engineer. Moments from the target, Dudley released the bomb load. 2 tons of explosives fell toward the railway yards. The B-17 jolted as the weight departed, and then an 88mm shell hit the nose. The impact was instantaneous. The entire forward section of Mispa was gone. The nose compartment, bombardier station, navigator's position, Norden bomb site, plexiglass panels. Everything in front of the cockpit vanished. Dudley and Henderson were killed instantly. The blast tore through the remaining fuselage, shifting the center of gravity backward. With no weight in the nose, the bomber pitched nearly vertical and began to stall. Through the empty space where instruments should have been, Swanson saw only the horizon. At 30,000 feet, temperatures were 40 degrees below zero. Wind tore at his flight suit, and blood from the explosion covered the deck. There was no control column, destroyed along with the nose structure. No instruments remained. The panel had been mounted forward and was gone. Swanson had nothing but his feel and horizon to judge the aircraft behavior. Yet the control cables ran intact from cockpit to rudder, elevators, and ailerons. Exposed and whipping in the wind, they were still functional. Somehow, he forced the nose down, somehow leveled the bomber, and somehow rejoined a loose formation. The B-17 had inherent stability, but no engineer had planned for flying without a cockpit. Physics and desperation alone kept Mispa airborne. Behind him, the surviving crew moved forward. The radio operator, the flight engineer, eyes fixed on exposed cables and the wind tearing through the plane. They understood what had to be done. Over 200 guns continued firing, and another shell was about to strike engine number 2. At 9:44 a.m., it hit. The right inboard radial engine exploded, oil and metal fragments spraying everywhere. Flames trailing along the left wing. The propeller windmilled for a moment, then ceased. With 3 engines remaining, the bomber lost speed as the formation pulled ahead. Without instruments, Swanson had no way to measure the drop. Technical Sergeant Frank Menzie, the flight engineer, moved forward from the top turret and immediately saw the exposed steel cables, elevator, rudder, and aileron wires, pulling violently in the wind. Someone had to hold them steady to keep the aircraft controllable. Staff Sergeant George summarily advanced from the radio compartment, while Staff Sergeant Robert Bell came forward from the waist gun position. They moved to the bomb bay, where the main control cables ran in full view. There was no need for discussion. The solution was clear. Someone had to hold these cables. Someone had to pull them exactly when Swanson needed control. The challenge was coordination. Swanson remained in the remnants of the cockpit, 40 feet ahead, while the crew stood in the bomb bay. The intercom was damaged, making communication nearly impossible. Swanson tested the rudder pedals. Nothing happened. The pedals were still attached to the floor, but the cables they normally control were buffeted by 300 miles per hour wind. He tried the throttles. Engines 1, 3, and 4 responded. That was something. But without control of the flight surfaces, the B-17 would eventually spiral out of formation or dive, or it could pitch up, stall, and spin. Either way, death awaited. The crew began to pull. They wrapped sections of cable around their gloved hands for grip. The steel was cold, biting through the gloves. Pull left on the rudder, and Mispa's nose moved left. Pull right, and it moved right. The elevators responded in the same way. Pull back, the nose rose. Release, it dropped. Every movement had to be perfectly timed. Too much, and the aircraft overcorrected. Too little, and nothing happened. And they did this without seeing what Swanson saw, without instruments, without indicators. The bomber lagged behind the formation. The other B-17s maintained speed, heading southwest toward the Adriatic. Mispa was slower now. Drag from a missing nose section was immense. The lost engine reduced power, and the formation was not waiting. Every minute over Hungary increased exposure to flak and fighters. Standard procedure was clear. Stragglers were left behind. By 9:46 a.m., Mispa was alone, 1 mile behind, then 2. Swanson could see the formation in the distance, a cluster of dark shapes against the summer sky. His plane was losing altitude slowly but steadily. 30,000 feet, now 29,000, then 28,000. The crew kept pulling. Hands cramped, cold biting through gloves, blood circulation cut off by the steel. Yet they continued. Fuel status was unknown. Gauge is gone with the instruments. Swanson had no idea how much remained in the tanks, how long 3 engines could keep them aloft, or even if they were heading the right way. Navigation required instruments, maps, a navigator, now dead somewhere over Budapest. All he knew was southwest. Fly southwest. Get out of Hungary. Reach Yugoslavia. The Adriatic. Italy. Home. Then the crew in the bomb bay waved frantically toward the rear. Swanson could not turn to look. The wind pressure through the open nose made any movement deadly. If he unbuckled, he could be pulled forward and out. He stayed braced, watching the horizon, keeping the wings level. But the frantic signals meant trouble in the rear, beyond the missing nose, the dead engine, the exposed cables. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, had been in his position when the nose exploded. The tail, isolated at the very end of the fuselage, accessed only by crawling to the waist area, now felt different. He had felt the violent pitch, the temporary stabilization, and now something new. The tail structure was flexing. The metal supporting the vertical and horizontal stabilizers was moving abnormally. Stress fractures or weakened supports from shrapnel were compromising the tail. If it failed, everyone would die instantly. A, B, 17 without a tail spins uncontrollably, tumbling end over end until disintegration or impact. No time to bail out, no time to react. The crew in the bomb bay understood. Through the fuselage, they could see the tail gunner's position and the flexing structure, but there was no way to fix it. Mispa descended to 26,000 feet, still heading southwest. Swanson estimated they had been flying without a cockpit for 4, maybe 5 minutes. Each second stretched endlessly. Wind roared deafeningly. Cold penetrated every layer of his suit, and his hands grew numb on the throttles, the only remaining means of control. Second Lieutenant Paul Burnt, the co-pilot, stayed in his seat. His control column gone, instruments gone. He watched the wings, engines, and the skies for fighters. German Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s hunted isolated bombers. A crippled B-17, separated from its formation, was an easy target. No supporting aircraft, no defensive fire from the group, just a single damaged bomber losing altitude over enemy territory. So far, no enemy fighters had appeared. The Luftwaffe was either engaged elsewhere or hadn't yet spotted Mispa. The crew continued to pull the exposed cables, their coordination slowly improving. When Swanson throttled back engine number 1, the aircraft yawned to the right. The crew countered by pulling the left rudder cable. Increasing power on engine 4 required another adjustment. This wasn't flying. It was survival by brute force. 10 men working in unison to keep 65,000 pounds of aluminum and steel aloft. At 9:50 a.m., Mispa crossed the Hungarian border into Yugoslavia. Swanson didn't know it. No map, no recognizable landmarks through the empty cockpit space. But the flak had stopped. The heaviest defenses were behind them. There was a faint chance of survival, entirely dependent on how long the tail could hold, how long the crew could maintain tension on the cables, and how long 3 engines could provide thrust. Without gauges, Swanson relied on the feel and vibration of the engines. They were running smoothly. Fuel was still flowing, but how much remained was impossible to tell. B-17 carried roughly 2,800 gallons of aviation gasoline across multiple tanks. At cruise power, for engines burn around 200 gallons per hour. But they weren't at cruise. They were at maximum continuous power on 3 engines, fighting to maintain altitude and speed. Consumption was far higher. Swanson made a clear decision. Get the crew out. The aircraft was failing, the tail structure deteriorating. Fuel unknown, still over-occupied territory. Every additional minute risked catastrophic failure. If Mispa broke apart in the air, no one would survive. But if the crew could bail while the plane was still controllable, most might live. They would be captured, endure months as POWs, but survive. Execution was a problem. Exiting AB-17 required coordination. Standard procedure assigned escape points. The forward hatch for bombardier and navigator, waist windows or rear door for others, ball turret rotated into position. Each crew member had trained dozens of times, but always in an intact aircraft with an intercom with time to organize. None of that existed now. Swanson couldn't communicate, couldn't leave his seat. The moment he moved, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. The crew pulling cables would lose reference. The bomber could dive or spin, and everyone aboard would die. At 9:52 a.m., Mispa was at 24,000 feet, 10 minutes into flying without a cockpit. Swanson's hands gripped the throttles. Feet on rudder pedals had achieved nothing without the crew's pull. Burnt sat motionless in the co-pilot's seat, watching wings, engines, and horizon, scanning for fighters. Neither spoke. The wind made words impossible. The crew in the bomb bay acted. They could feel the tail structure flexing, see stress cracks spreading along the fuselage. Remaining aboard meant death if the aircraft came apart. One by one, they moved the waist gun windows. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell clipped on his parachute and jumped. Then Charles Kelly. Then George Semelli. Then Technical Sergeant Frank Mency. Each jump made control harder. Fewer hands on cables meant less precision. The bomber began to wallow. Wings dipped left and right. Nose pitched up slightly. Swanson adjusted throttles, but throttle alone wasn't enough. Rudder, elevators, and the cables were still needed. But the crew was abandoning ship. It was the only rational choice. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, crawled forward through the narrow passage, emerged into the waist area, and saw the empty spots where his mates had stood. Control cable slack, the nose hole 40 feet ahead. He clipped on his chute and jumped. By 9:54 a.m., 5 crewmen were under parachutes over Yugoslavia. 5 would survive the day, captured within hours, but alive. 5 remained. Swanson at the controls, Byrne at the co-pilot seat, and 3 others moving toward exits from the rear positions. Mispa was now at 22,000 feet, still descending, barely controllable, tail structure teetering on failure. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish went next through a waist window, followed seconds later by Staff Sergeant Robert Tucker. That left 3 aboard, Swanson, Burnt, and 1 more crew member still making his way forward from the rear. The aircraft was growing more unstable by the second. With almost no one left pulling the control cables, Mispa responded only to engine power and the residual aerodynamic stability built into its design, stability intended for normal flight, not for a bomber missing its nose and with a failing tail. At 9:56 a.m., the last crew member reached the waist gun area, clipped on, and disappeared into the slipstream. Swanson and Burnt were alone. Two men in the remnants of a B-17 Flying Fortress at 20,000 feet over Yugoslavia. The bomber continued its slow descent. 3 engines ran, but the aircraft was no longer truly flyable. Lift from the wings kept aloft, but without cable operators, precise control was impossible. Swanson turned his head, making brief eye contact with Burnt. No words passed between them. The roar of wind would drown them out anyway, but the message was clear. Burnt had to leave. The co-pilot had no function left. Staying meant almost certain death when the aircraft finally broke apart. The only rational choice was to bail while altitude remained, while a parachute could still deploy safely. Burnt unbuckled, rose from the co-pilot seat, and carefully moved aft along the flight deck. He reached the waist gun exit, glanced back at Swanson, still locked to the throttles, eyes forward, holding the dying bomber as steady as possible, and jumped. 30 seconds later, he was gone. Swanson was alone. One man in a 65,000-pound bomber at 19,000 feet, descending at roughly 200 feet per minute. Not a dive, just a steady fall. 3 engines provided forward thrust, but not enough to maintain altitude. The missing nose created massive drag. The aerodynamic profile was shattered. Mispa had become a flying brick with wings. Fuel status remained a mystery. Wing tanks could be full or nearly empty. Engine sound gave no clue. Cyclone engines ran smoothly until fuel was exhausted, then simply stopped. No sputtering, no warning. If all 3 quit at once, the bomber would drop out of the sky. Swanson estimated their position. Approximately 14 minutes southwest from Budapest, airspeed roughly 180 miles per hour. They had likely crossed the Hungarian border into Yugoslavia, possibly approaching mountains or the Adriatic coast. All guesses. No instruments, no maps, no navigator. The aircraft was blind, and so was he. The question was how long to stay aboard. Every additional minute allowed the crew under parachutes to gain distance from the crash site. German patrols would soon comb the area, but more separation increased their chances of evasion. Survival. Remaining aboard increased Swanson's personal risk. The tail structure flexed with each gust. At any moment, the bomber could break apart. When he eventually bailed, he would have to unbuckle, stand, crawl to an exit, and jump, while the aircraft was uncontrollable, potentially entering a fatal spin. At 9:58 a.m., Swanson made his decision. 2 more minutes. 2 minutes to give his crew distance, a better chance at survival. Then he would go, hands on throttles. He monitored the 3 right-hand engines, number 1 on the far left, number 3 inboard on the right, number 4 on the far right, all running, all consuming unknown amounts of fuel. The bomber descended through 18,000 feet. At 10 a.m. exactly, Swanson released the throttles and unbuckled. The moment the harness straps came loose, wind pressure threatened to pull him forward toward a massive nose opening. He pressed back, then carefully stood. Immediately, the aircraft pitched, rolling gently left. Without anyone controlling the cables or making adjustments, Mispa began to fall faster. Swanson moved quickly aft along the narrow crawlway to the bomb bay. Behind him, the nose dropped, control cables slack, no hands holding them. He could feel the bomber accelerating toward a dive, with maybe 30 seconds before the angle became too steep, before G-forces made movement impossible, before the aircraft might enter spin. Reaching the waist gun area, the aluminum floor vibrating beneath his boots, the wind roaring, he grabbed his parachute pack from the storage rack, clipped at his harness, and edged toward the window opening. The bomber was now in a steep dive, not vertical, but sharp enough that Swanson had to brace against the fuselage to stay upright. He reached the waist gun window, looked down at the Yugoslav countryside 17,000 feet below, and jumped. The slipstream hit him like a wall, spinning him sideways. Mispa roared past, already 200 feet away, accelerating downward. Swanson pulled the ripcord. The parachute snapped open with a violent jerk, knocking the wind from his lungs. Then came relative quiet. Engine noise faded as the B-17 continued its deadly descent. Swanson watched the aircraft fall, the tail section still barely attached, the rear fuselage flexing like a reed. At 15,000 feet, the tail finally tore away. The forward section pitched almost vertically nose down, falling for 8 seconds before crashing into a line of trees 2 miles away. Black smoke rose as fuel tanks ignited on impact. Nothing survived. Had Swanson remained aboard 30 more seconds, he would have died. His parachute descent was slow, carried southwest by the prevailing wind. Below, scattered farms, forests, and villages passed under him. German occupation forces patrolled the land. Somewhere below, his crew members who had jumped earlier were descending. Somewhere below lay the reality of capture. The ground came up faster than expected. Trees loomed directly beneath him. He tried steering toward an open field, but the canopy allowed little precision. Branches hit at roughly 15 miles per hour. They snapped, and the chute caught on limbs. Swanson slammed into a thick branch with his left side, breaking his leg somewhere between knee and ankle. Pain exploded. He fell another 10 feet, tangled in parachute lines and branches, 15 feet above the ground. Blood ran down his leg. His flight suit was torn. Deep lacerations marked his left thigh. The leg bent at an unnatural angle. He couldn't move it, couldn't bear weight, couldn't climb down. Suspended in the harness, he fought to control pain and stay conscious. Voices came from below, German voices. Soldiers arrived at the tree's base within minutes, having seen the parachutes and heard the B-17 crash. Swanson hung motionless, unable to escape. One soldier called up. He didn't respond. They debated how to get him down, found a ladder from a nearby farm, and climbed up to cut the parachute lines. Carefully, they lowered him to the ground, trying not to worsen the leg injury. A German medic examined him. The leg was splintered with wooden boards and cloth strips. Morphine dulled the sharp agony. Deep cuts were bandaged. Swanson felt the pain fade to a distant throb. No other injuries were apparent. Ribs intact. No head trauma. No detectable internal bleeding. Infection remained a risk. Proper surgery essential. But the medic did what he could with limited supplies. Swanson was moved to a local command post, then to a German medical facility. A doctor examined the fracture, set the bone despite Swanson passing out twice during the procedure, and applied a plaster cast from ankle to hip. The fracture was clean. Recovery would take months, but the bone would heal. Over the next 3 days, the rest of Mispa's crew was captured. All 8 who had bailed out were found within 20 meters of the crash site. None had evaded capture. The Yugoslav countryside was heavily patrolled. Partisan groups roamed the mountains, but the crew had landed in German-controlled farmland. One by one, they were brought to the processing center. Swanson saw them arrive. Burnt, Gmensi, Semeli, Bell, Kelly, Tucker, Hish, all alive, largely uninjured apart from minor cuts and bruises. Now all were prisoners of war. They were sent to Stalag Luft in Austria, a camp for captured Allied aircrew. Approximately 10,000 American and British pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and flight engineers were housed there. Conditions were harsh but not brutal. Food was limited. Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly. Barracks were cold in winter, medical care minimal. Germans generally observed Geneva Convention protocols for officer prisoners. No mass executions, no systematic torture, only confinement, boredom, and waiting. Swanson's leg healed slowly. He spent the first 2 months on crutches. In September 1944, the cast came off. Physical therapy was basic. He walked the camp perimeter daily, rebuilding strength in the damaged leg. By October, Swanson could walk unaided. By November, his limp was barely noticeable. By December, he had physically recovered, but the war continued. The camp remained locked, guard patrolled the wire, and escape attempts were rare and mostly unsuccessful. The crew of Mispa settled into the rhythm of captivity. They spoke of the mission, the 88mm shell, the 10 minutes spent flying without a cockpit, the hand-pulled control cables, the bomber falling into the Yugoslav forest, and the instant deaths of Dudley and Henderson. They reflected on how close they had come to dying that day, and then they waited for the war to end, waited for liberation, waited to go home. Winter gave way to spring. As Soviet forces advanced in the east, the Germans began evacuating camps. Prisoners were marched westward in long columns. Conditions worsened. Food grew scarce. Some men died along the way. Others vanished in the chaos. Swanson and his crew stayed together, marching through Germany as the Third Reich crumbled. On April 30th, 1945, American forces reached their column. Freedom came at last. 9 months of captivity ended on a dirt road in central Germany. American tanks rolled past. Soldiers handed out food, water, and cigarettes, and medical personnel assessed the prisoners. From there, the crew was transported to collection points, then airfields, then back to Italy, and eventually home to the United States. All 8 survivors returned. The men who had pulled control cables by hand at 30,000 feet over Budapest. The men who had jumped from a dying bomber and lived. Evald Swanson went back to civilian life in Michigan, married, raised a family, and worked quietly for decades. He rarely spoke of July 14, 1944. When asked, he said only that he had been lucky, that the crew had been lucky, that Dudley and Henderson had not been. He did not consider himself a hero, just a pilot who had done his duty under impossible circumstances. The Army Air Forces disagreed. Swanson was promoted over the years, eventually retiring as lieutenant colonel. Recognition came not for a single mission, but for a career service. Yet that one mission remained defining. 10 minutes without a cockpit, 10 minutes that should have killed everyone aboard. The crew stayed in contact. They attended 483rd Bomb Group reunions, gathering every few years to remember the war, the missions, and the men who did not return. Their bond was unbreakable. They had survived what should have been impossible. Flying a bomber with no nose, no instruments, no cockpit, and exposed control cables in 300 miles per hour wind. They had endured through coordination, determination, and sheer refusal to give up. In doing so, they honored Dudley and Henderson by surviving, ensuring their sacrifice was not in vain. Paul Burt remained close to Swanson in Michigan, lifelong friends. Frank Gmency returned to his family and rarely spoke of the war. George Semelli preserved photographs from the mission, showing them to grandchildren decades later, explaining the impossibility of pulling steel cables while a bomber fell apart around them. The others dispersed across the country, but all remembered. Evald Swanson died in 2009 at the age of 89. He had lived a full life, witnessing the world and aviation evolve, from propeller-driven bombers to jets and spacecraft. Yet the aircraft he remembered most vividly was Mispa, the B-17G that lost its nose over Budapest, flying on borrowed time and sheer crew determination. It proved that human could surpass engineering limits. This story preserves their legacy. Every like, every subscription, every comment ensures these forgotten heroes are remembered. Kenneth Dudley and Joe Henderson, 23 and 24 years old, died instantly when the 88mm shell struck. They never returned home. But the 8 men who survived carried their memory through 9 months in a POW camp, across decades in Michigan and throughout America. Through this story, their names live on. They deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.